First is a gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition.
To address the House for 1 minute, please.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I rise today to call on Congress to rule out an end-of-the-year lame duck end-run vote on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. No other time in the Congress is less accountable to the people who entrust us to represent their interests than the period between election and the swearing in of a new Congress in January. That's why it's called lame duck. Retiring members, or those who lost elections, still have a say. And whose interests are they more likely to represent? Sometimes corporate interests weigh in with tantalizing offers of high-dollar remuneration on their retirement. Or for those fresh off an election, a lame duck can present pressures from donors who funded their campaigns. In 2000, I watched this scenario play out to pass when the permanent normal trade relations with China unfortunately passed. For China's PNTR vote, look at Texas. The president secured at least 5 member votes by promising an environmental cleanup of a military factory, a study on job losses due to imports, and finalized an EPA study for a pipeline. And what happened to those promises? Nothing. In fact, the factory closed with the district losing 5,000 jobs. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we've been told time and again that free trade deals create jobs, but they outsource our jobs instead. Americans deserve a vote from accountable elected representatives. No lame duck TPP vote. I yield back my remaining time.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2015, the gentleman from Wisconsin, 60 minutes as a designee of the minority leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I am here on behalf of the Progressive Caucus, which is in charge of this hour. We are here today to talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and trade. The people in the Progressive Caucus have been some of the leaders in the movement to make sure that we have trade deals that protect American jobs and lift our wages here in the United States. We want to make sure there are environmental protections across the globe. We want to make sure our food is safe and our prescription drugs are affordable. We want to make sure there's human rights in countries that do trade with the United States, and we want to make sure we're addressing issues like currency manipulation. All of those issues are important when you want to advance trade. No one in this room is against trade. We're all for increasing our ability to have more exports and to have imports into this country. But you have to have trade deals that work on behalf of the American worker. And all too often, past trade deals have cost us jobs here in the United States. They've made our wages continue to be depressed. And that's not a good trade deal in the minds of the members of the Progressive Caucus. And that's why we are here at this hour to talk specifically about what is good trade, why we're skeptical of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and why we especially don't want to see a vote during the lame duck session after the election in November, with people who are no longer going to be serving in Congress. To be taking that vote at that time would be an especially bad idea. Now, today is a national call-in day of action on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's over 90 public interest groups that have been calling our offices, and I've heard my staff picking up the phone over and over and over again today, responding to people who want to make sure that we have trade deals that take care of all those things that we talked about, all the things that members of the Progressive Caucus have been leaders in this Congress trying to advocate for. And in conjunction with the tens of thousands of people who've called Congress today to urge their members not only to not support the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because it's really not a trade deal. There's parts of it about trade. This is a rewriting of corporate rules that could have huge ramifications. 40% of the world's gross domestic product is involved in this one large deal. And we want to make sure we get it right, not just fast. And that's why we are joining with these groups today, to make sure that people know what's in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and why it's vitally important that we don't take this up during a lame duck session. As I said, not only do we have members who will no longer be serving here, who might even be looking for jobs with some of the very industries advocating for the Trans-Pacific Partnership because it'll benefit their bottom lines, but also we have 2 presidential candidates in the main 2 parties who both oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This should be something that, as much respect as I have, enormous respect for President Obama, we should allow the next president to be able to address trade, especially when a deal like this has so much controversy and so many questions about it. So we are here during the next hour going to hear from various members of the Progressive Caucus. It is my honor to yield some time right now to one of my colleagues from the great state of California. The 17th District of California is very lucky to have a representative who has been such an outspoken advocate for middle-class families, not just in California but across the country. At this time, Madam Speaker, I would like to yield as much time as needed to my colleague from the 17th District of California, Representative Mike Honda.
Thank you, my colleague. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I rise today to voice my opposition to TPP, an unfair trade deal which will hurt our nation's workers, our environment, and give corporations dangerous new rights. Through an alarming expansion of the investor-state dispute settlement process, the ISDS, TPP will give corporations a legal weapon to enforce their agendas on sovereign nations. Corporations have already used ISDS to bring over 700 lawsuits against more than 100 governments around the world. When my home state of California banned the use of MTBE as an additive in gasoline because it was polluting the groundwater, the Canadian company sued, costing the state and federal government millions of dollars to defend the case. TPP would extend these rights to 1,000 additional corporations owning more than 9,200 subsidiaries. We need to stop foreign corporations from suing the U.S. government before accountable panels of corporate lawyers. And while giving these rights to corporations, TPP will provide little benefit to the American economy. The widely cited estimate of 0.13% growth in U.S. GDP under TPP is over 10 years. It's not an annual gain. A gain that benefits only a few is undone by the negative impact TPP will have on workers at home and abroad. Under NAFTA, 700,000 American jobs moved to Mexico to take advantage of Mexican workers, making 30% less than American workers, even after adjusting for differences in living costs. While TPP requires nations to implement minimum wage laws, nothing in the language of the deal prevents them from setting the wage as low as 5 cents an hour. TPP is a small win for high-income earners at the huge expense of low-income workers. TPP also lacks strong provisions to deal with countries with repulsive human rights abuses, including human trafficking and intolerance of the LGBTQ communities. Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei criminalize consensual same-sex sexual relations. Rewarding them with a trade agreement is really very unacceptable. Throughout my tenure in Congress, I have evaluated each trade agreement based on whether it ensures strong, clear, and enforceable labor, environmental, and human rights standards. I do not believe that the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that was sent to Congress meets my standards. It does not deserve to be considered during a lame duck session. As it is currently written, TPP should not be brought to a vote. Should not be brought to a vote, period. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the gentleman from the 17th District of California for his words. As he mentioned, there are a number of provisions that you could start to drill down to in the giant volumes that make up the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There are provisions that I think the American people have no idea. In fact, I would argue there are some people in Congress who have no idea of what's in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Just one of those provisions that Representative Honda mentioned is the Investor-State Dispute Settlement Process, the ISDS provisions, where you have a 3-person tribunal of unelected, unaccountable people people who are corporate lawyers one day and then fair arbitrators of the law another day, that set up this separate legal process from the American judicial system that international companies, multinational companies, can access if they want to sue a local government for a law that they've passed that they think affects their future profits. Think about it. Everyone else in the country has to follow the court system we have in the United States. But if a multinational company, because of the provisions in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, decide that they want to go around that system and go to 3 corporate lawyers who form a tribunal under this ISDS provisions, and they want to challenge that law, they can sue for monetary damages. Think about it. For example, if the state of Wisconsin, where I come from, were to pass a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage, and it would be challenged potentially by multinational corporations saying that's going to affect their future profits, they could sue the taxpayers of Wisconsin over that law. And this isn't just something that we're dreaming up. Over and over again, we have seen countries in trade deals be sued by multinational corporations because of environmental law and other laws that they've passed that they've said affect their future profits. And it doesn't happen in the American legal system. Now, as bad as this sounds, to skirt the American legal system, a special system for multinational corporations, let me tell you what's even worse about that provision. It's only a tribunal for those corporations, but the parts of the trade agreement that affect labor law or environmental law don't have access to the same provisions. They have to go through the normal legal court system. So recently, there was a labor dispute with the country of Honduras with a company, and it took us 6 years to get that resolved. So for environmental law, for labor law, for things that are going to affect most people, we still have to follow the court system, which is the way it should be. But for multinational corporations, they have this special streamlined process with basically their own arbitrators making the decisions, allowing you to sue taxpayers within a local government or a state government that may pass a law. Clearly, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That's just one of those provisions that's a real problem. Another thing that Mike Honda from the great state of California said was he talked about some of the human rights violations, and there are explicit human rights violations with some of the countries that don't respect things like single mothers, who don't respect the LGBT community. And those are things that we absolutely can't allow. Our country has done so much to work with other countries to raise human rights standards. And yet in this bill, this trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it does not have those things in place to make sure that we've got those protections for so many different people in so many different provisions. So what he mentioned are just a couple of the provisions. Let me mention something else I think that people don't know about. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is made up of countries that are going to make up for 40% of the world's gross domestic product. Now, it's one thing to have a trade agreement with a country that's very similar, like Canada, or a country that, like Japan, that also does a lot of similar goods that they're producing. But we also have countries in here like Vietnam where they don't allow trade unions, where people make on average 65 cents an hour. As you can tell, there's going to be a huge difference in a trade agreement that you have with a country like Canada and a country like Vietnam. But in this trade agreement, everyone is lumped together, and there's a long lead time that Vietnam would have to try to get their act together, especially just around issues like having a trade union, much less around those wage issues. But you can just imagine that if you open that door to have trade preferences for a country like Vietnam at 65 cents an hour, yes, I will contend that we will lift their wages ever so slightly. But I will also tell you, based on evidence we've seen from past trade deals, that you will further depress our wages here. You will keep the wages flat because that's what happens with these trade agreements. And more jobs that are done here in the U.S. will go overseas. And I say this from someone who grew up in a very industrial town. I grew up in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We made autos for the entire time I grew up in that town. When I was growing up, it was American Motors Company. We made Pacers and Gremlins and some cars that people actually bought. But thousands and thousands of people worked at those auto plants and supported their families with good family-supporting middle-class wages. That's the type of jobs that we need here in this country. But those jobs aren't going to happen under these trade agreements. And I've watched in my hometown of Kenosha, after American Motors sold to Renault, and then Renault sold to Chrysler, and Chrysler made engines for Jeeps, at some point, finally they went away. And we lost what was over 5,000 jobs at one time in the city of Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the ripple effects of the industries that fed into that company. Because all too often we watch those jobs go to Mexico, to Canada, to other countries because of wages. Another thing, for almost 3 decades of my life, I've had a specialty printing business. And one of the things that we do is screen print T-shirts. So I've been buying T-shirts and goods like that for nearly 30 years. And over the years, I've watched the U.S. mills go away. And more of those jobs have gone to countries literally that are paying wages that are sub-poverty. I have gone to El Salvador and met with people who work in the sweatshops, where people make $3 a day. And because that sweatshop area is in a special free trade zone that's not near where people live, they spend $1 of that to get there. Now, this is granted a couple decades ago, but the wages are still severely depressed. And those jobs that were in America now are going to countries. In fact, one of the things we're hearing out of this trade agreement is Central American countries are afraid they're now going to lose jobs to places like Vietnam because they can have even lower wages. None of those things are going to help the American worker. So there's a reason why this fall, when you talk and hear from candidates who are running for office, we have 2 presidential candidates from the major parties, both opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership as it's currently written. We have candidates across the country for Congress and the Senate running ads talking about a better vision for what trade should be. And with all of that going on, it makes no sense whatsoever that we would take this up after the November elections, between that little period of time between November 8th and the end of the year, when we're going to have a new Congress sworn in January, to take that up with the Congress, with people that may not be serving here and may be looking for jobs from the very companies that advocate for these sweetheart multinational deals, is a huge, huge mistake. So that's why the 90 organizations today are having a day of action. Tens of thousands of calls coming into Washington, D.C. to try to make sure that Congress does the right thing around trade. That means making sure that we have trade deals that, one, protect American jobs and hopefully grow American jobs. One that protect our wages and hopefully grow our wages. Ones that protect us when it comes to things like food safety. Ones that protect us on things like pharmaceutical prices. We want trade agreements that make sure that you don't have a country, you can have the best language in a trade deal, but if you still allow currency manipulation, you can make that language virtually meaningless. And there is nothing in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that addresses currency manipulation, which is a huge, huge problem. So those are some of the things that we're trying to get done, much less international human rights provisions that should be in any meaningful trade agreement. So it's with that, many of us are going to be talking about this over the next few months, but tonight I would like to yield time to another one of my colleagues who has been one of the leaders in Congress on this issue. He represents New York State's 20th District. It is my honor to yield some time, Madam Speaker, to Representative Tonko from New York's 20th.
Thank you, and I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin for yielding, and thank you, Representative Pocan, for leading us in what I think is very meaningful discussion this evening in special order. Trade, absolutely critical to our economy, but fair trade, not free trade. A fair trade situation where our manufacturers, our businesses are operating on a level playing field, where they have an equal shot at being able to go forward and be productive and provide for jobs, the dignity of work for Americans from coast to coast. You know, recently I talked to an individual, Representative Pocan, in my district who had to close his doors. And it was years of assistance that we provided when I was yet in the State Assembly and then after in the U.S. Congress to assist them so that they could be competitive. But their major competitors were in China. And if we try to talk about public-private partnerships as being something that don't exist out there on this House floor, then we're not getting it. It was the public-private coziness of China that really destroyed the competitive edge of a business in my community, one that had spun fibers for many defense contracts. And they alluded to the fact that in some cases, the government, China, will own the building. The government, China, will pay the utility bill. They will offer subsidies to the industry. And then, as was just mentioned by my colleague from Wisconsin, they'll manipulate the currency. All four of those items drag down the opportunity for American workers. It dulls the competitive edge that we should be able to enjoy in the marketplace. We build smarter, and it doesn't have to be cheaper. But when these sorts of dynamics are working against us, we're really swimming upstream with very difficult challenges facing us. Now, this factory owner had told me if you take away one or two of the items that I just mentioned, we win easily. If you take three of the four away, we're a strong winner. And if you take all four away, winners hands down. And so it's about fairness. It's about having an equal shot at the opportunity to function in the international marketplace and be able to be creative and innovative with all sorts of intellectual capacity that comes oftentimes with research that should be another counterpart to this equation. And when we do that, we are the strength beyond belief. And so our efforts here in the House, Representative Pocan, Representative Slaughter from upstate New York, Representative DeLauro from Connecticut, a great number of us who have been working together, Representative Doggett from Texas, a great number of us working to make certain that our colleagues know about the damage inflicted if we go forward with the current format of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's important for us to be pro-worker, pro-business, pro-trade in a free or rather a fair capacity, not a free and open-ended concept that has been part and parcel to negotiated deals before this. Now, what I hear oftentimes is that the biggest problem that had come when talking to manufacturers in Northeast U.S. is that many of the arrangements in these contracts were never implemented. So the contracts might have been a little weak or unfair to begin with, but when you add to that the lack of genuine implementation, then you really have compounded the damage, and the pain is real, and it is the exodus of many, many jobs in upstate New York. That is the territory of the 20th Congressional District. Now, Mark, I have to tell you, I am the host community, my 20th congressional seat in New York, the eastern end to the Erie Canal corridor. Now, that gave birth to a number of mill towns. They took a little town called New York and said they were going to make it a port, and then by building the canal, we developed a necklace of communities dubbed mill towns that became epicenters of invention and innovation. And we sparked a westward movement. We inspired an industrial revolution. And because of that, there was a great bit of manufacturing going on. And I know that we need to upgrade and retrofit and continually grow the economy by transforming some of the workforce skill sets. I know that. We invest in that. But to put us at a competitive disadvantage by having these situations where we don't require climate change response in the contract, so we're allowing people to live in 50s and 60s standards with the environment, and we're doing our best to respond to climate change. We see the damage that's been ravaging many of our communities, either through extreme dry situations, drought in the Southwest, or flooding in the Southeast and in the Northeast. These are issues that need to be addressed, and we're doing the right thing. But when the left hand is not responding to what the right hand is doing, and we're giving people a different level of standards, workforce conditions, workforce protection, these are things that need to be standard across the board and not sinking down to a lowest common denominator, but rising to the highest level amongst us. I think of the fact that we could end up with situations that have favored a labor scale, a payment mechanism, such as 65 cents per hour for Vietnamese workers, as being that standard out there across the world. Nothing could be more harmful. That's undignified when it's seen through the lens of the worker. So there's a lot of work to be done, improvement that needs to be had. We have opposed the TPP in its current form, and certainly we're for trade. It's important for us to have that marketplace. We're 4.7% of the world's population. Of course we want to advance trade. It needs to be fair trade, and that is what we're asking here. This is the message that we have been resonating so as to make certain that there is progress made here for our communities, our neighborhoods, our workers, our businesses, and we won't stop until we're successful with that. And I believe the message is probably, not even dealing with this during a lame duck session of Congress. So I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts. I'll stay with you in this special order for a while, Representative Pocan, because this is a very important topic to workers from coast to coast. And again, it's the fairness that we want to bring not only to the workforce, but to the business community that invests in jobs in our neighborhoods.
Great. Would the gentleman yield to a question?
Sure. Absolutely.
So this is my second term in Congress. You've been here a little longer, and one of the questions I have is when I was elected 4 years ago, I remember New Year's Eve, you were all voting during a lame duck session on things. And tell me more about this lame duck session portion. I think that's the real question. Some people might even be amenable to what's in the TPP, which we still have arguments about. But to do that in a lame duck session certainly sets up problems. Could you explain a little more about why that's a problem?
Well, I think that, there needs to be, strong dialogue here. And, with the elections being early in November and probably some time to pass before we really gather again and reconvene as a base, as a body, as a house, and then with holidays, assuming some of the time during December, it gives you precious little time to really have that dialogue, that conversation that is so essential. And, great things happen when we communicate, when we talk to each other and suggest these are concerns, let's raise the given solutions that are indeed required to make it acceptable. That takes time. And quite literally, there has been no work on this. People have been advancing the TPP in its now given format, and many people see weaknesses, loopholes, concern for workers, situations where labor is not protected by union forces because the governments run the unions, and if you're dissident to the cause, then there's just extreme outcomes for individuals. If you become that whistleblower or that critic, that dissident, you're then maybe finding yourself incarcerated. So it's important for us to clear up a lot of the issues, to correct them, fine-tune them, everything from environmental standards to worker protection to the cost of pharmaceuticals, which has been raised many times over, and what it might do to the average price tag out there. So not enough time. And to rush and get that done, to beat the clock, so to speak, I think is a faulty bit of a scenario. It's not the way to do something as so critically important as this is.
If the gentleman would yield to one other question.
Sure.
So you mentioned there's a lot of areas that we clearly need to make changes on. There's areas of concern around labor rights and environmental rights and consumer protections and the ISDS provisions and other things. Why not simply amend the trade agreement to fix those things?
Well, Congress has very little opportunity to adjust. It's basically a thumbs up, thumbs down. We can recommend. It's not like we can make major adjustments. The administrator of the overseeing the document will have to take that back and make recommended changes. You have to bring other nations together to get agreement because it's It's 40% of the world's GDP. That is the audience for this given negotiated settlement. And this TPP covers a huge portion of the world's GDP. So there are a lot of partners that would have a say in the process. We can recommend, and then, the changes that we can inspire are quite mild compared to what needs to be done by the framers of the settlement.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for all your work on
My
this,
pleasure.
gentlemen.
And, well, back at you, because it's taken a lot of time for all of us who have been whipping in the House, and I think to the credit of our group, we have sacrificed a lot of time, but we have been working in a steadfast way that has allowed people to really question how this fits into their given district. And, when this is done, it's got to be done correctly because it's there. It's a long-term project. And, people have seen what faulty agreements can mean in their districts. And, while we lost many manufacturing jobs, luckily, this administration has helped to hold on to several manufacturing jobs and stop the bleeding. But now let's grow this and let's invest in the intellect for manufacturing. Let's make it smarter, and let's also retrofit our systems so that we do have a heavy hand in from a competitive edge, and at the same time, let's get the negotiated agreement that is most favorable to a level playing field.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much, gentlemen. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I think the point that the gentleman brought up, especially around why we can't amend it, is a really significant one. Congress gave up its ability when it passed Trade Promotion Authority to allow the president to do the final negotiations. We gave up our ability to have any amendments, and we have limited debate. So when there are so many concerns with this trade agreement, unfortunately, there's very little other than an up or down vote that we can do, which is exactly why when you have two major party presidential candidates and scores of candidates for federal office across the country in both parties opposing this agreement, to allow people who could be kicked out of office essentially by the voters to make that decision in the lame duck is certainly undemocratic with a small d. And that's one of the real problems that we're facing on this. The other issue that you brought up, gentlemen, and I want to talk about too, is the companies and the job loss. Other trade agreements we've had in the past, we've seen that we've had a net job loss, both, I believe, from the Korean Free Trade Agreement, where we were made one promise and a different result happened, from NAFTA. I just last year had a company leave Lafayette County, Wisconsin. Lafayette County is one of the most rural counties in the state of Wisconsin. The largest city is 2,400 people, Darlington. It's one of two counties in the state of Wisconsin that doesn't have a stop-and-go light. This is a rural area. And a company just last year with about 32 jobs that did auto parts left to go to Mexico. Now, there is some trade adjustment assistance that can help on the short term to help the workers, but think about it, 32 jobs in a community of 2,400. I also have Madison, Wisconsin, my district, with about 240,000 people. That would be like losing 3,000 plus jobs in the city of Madison, Wisconsin. That's the effect that happened to that city, Darlington, because of previous past trade deals. That's why it's so important we get it right, and we get it right the first time. And in this case, I think there are many people in both parties who don't think we have it quite right. And that's why we need to address it. Another thing I want to raise that we talked about, and I think it's so important because this is new news from this week, the provisions around the investor-state dispute settlement, the provisions that allow essentially the multinational corporations to sue government if they think something affects their future profits. Just this week, there was a group of academics who have traditionally embraced free trade but are alarmed by the inclusion of the ISDS provisions in the deal, just sent a letter to Congress warning of this system. 223 strong, led by Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe, warned that the U.S. will be subject to a flurry of suits by profit-seeking actors with no interest in working through a democratic or constitutional process. And let me read the quote in the letter. Quote, "Unfortunately, the final TPP text simply replicates nearly word for word many of the problematic provisions from past agreements and indeed would vastly expand the U.S. government's potential liability under the ISDS system. This is about our sovereignty. If I could yield time again to the other gentleman.
Okay, if you'll yield.
Yes.
Doesn't this give corporations an opportunity to undo regulations that are established by our country or laws that are established?
Well, the net effect by suing for financial gain will do exactly that. If someone's going to have to pay damages, there was a ISDS provision that happened in Peru over an environmental law change by a company that had toxic contamination, and that company is now, because of that change to law, environmental law in Peru, is demanding $800 million from the country. $800 million because they are saying that somehow is going to affect their future profits and because of a violation of a trade agreement. These are real. This is just one of many, many examples. Canada, other countries have been sued through these provisions. But now we have the experts in the United States telling us not to do that. So this is something that clearly is one of the biggest problems that's in there. And as we said, you can't amend it out. We're not allowed as Congress. We gave up our ability to amend that section out. And if I could yield time to the gentleman.
And I think what you're pointing to here is a very important component of the agreement. We do lose the control, the direct authority required of us by the constituency that places its trust in each and every representative that's elected to come to Congress. They believe rightfully that we're going to have their best interest. We vote in accordance with what we hear from them about standards that should be maintained and established and implemented, and to have that passed on to a court of whatever, of a format that is far removed from a given situation and may be looking at just greed as a factor, an unwillingness to pay abundantly well for what our standards that should be maintained for just reasons, moves the process away from us with any control that we might have had taken away. And I think that anonymity is a dangerous outcome of a result of this sort of agreement. So, I think that, again, there is a lot of fine print in the agreement that has to be really examined and thoroughly reviewed so that we're not putting our situations at risk, our communities at risk, and all in all, it's wanting to maintain standards that will respond to the needs of the environment. We know how critical that is. We know how much improvement is required, and that we've made great gains. But for those who signed into the process, then we're actually directly communicating to the executive branch saying, let's get this fast track going. Why would you circumvent your role? Why would you as a member of the House want to, remove yourself from the process when we should be here reviewing, examining, recommending, and at least having some sort of input that won't pass it over and absolve ourselves of given responsibility. So I appreciate, again, you yielding, Representative Pocan.
Sure. Well, thank you. And, as much as this is the Progressive Caucus Special Order Hour and many of us are working against this, I see Republicans in the room, and I know Republicans are just as concerned about the sovereignty of this country. And when you have the ISDS provisions that you have, you take away that sovereignty. So I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, Independent. You want to make sure that if we have a legal system here, it's a legal system for everyone. And there's not a special system set up for a few multinational corporations that no one else can access with their own players arbitrating these decisions. That's the real problem. I will close our hour just by repeating a few of the things that I think are really important for people who are watching to understand. This is a day of action, and 90 organizations have had calls coming into Congress throughout the day. There are tens of thousands of calls have come into Washington, D.C. to ask people, one, don't support TPP, but especially don't support a vote on the Trans-Pacific Partnership in a lame duck Congress. Don't let people who've just been rejected by the voters make a decision that could impact this country for decades in the future. Don't allow a vote that's going to take away more American jobs and further depress our wages here. That's what people have been calling us all day about. And I think that's an important question for anyone who wants to serve in this body is, are we going to give up those sorts of sovereignty issues? Are we going to give up the very concerns we have around things like food safety and prescription drug prices, around labor standards and environmental standards? Are we going to give all of that up through one giant trade deal that has 40% of the world's gross domestic product wrapped into it and think that any agreement we have with Canada and Vietnam are identical? I don't think anyone really believes that's in the best interest of America, and that's why we had this special order tonight. That's why so many people called in today. We thank those people for watching, and we hope that you'll get active on this issue as well. It's important that we have trade, but we need fair trade, not just free trade. And with that, Madam Speaker, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back.